So we're returning to a guy that we haven't spoken about for quite a while. I had to just read up and remind myself about him. Known as Rico the Chilean, known as the most dangerous Chilean in the world, known as Ricardo Riquelma Vega.
Yes.
And somebody who was linked to Daniel Kinahan. In fact, one of the named heads of the European super cartel. He was arrested ultimately in Santiago, brought back to the Netherlands, where he is coming to the end of a sentence for convictions in relation to organised crime. But the Dutch do not want to let this guy out.
No, I mean, El Rico probably rose to the top of the global cocaine market. I mean, one of the biggest figures across the globe. Like a lot of the people involved in the super cartel, he was Chilean. He was born in Chile, but ultimately he ended up in Amsterdam, where he was mostly raised in a suburb there, along with his family. He had spent some time in prison in Germany. Came out of that as a young man and became a major drug supplier using his own contacts in Chile, where really they were getting the cocaine from Colombia and moving it through Chile. Ultimately, he was convicted and sentenced to 11 years in prison. But yeah,
and that was in 2021. He was the leader of a criminal organisation that ordered assassinations, traded cocaine and laundered criminal proceeds. That organisation they're talking about really he was kind of like of equal or slightly equal with Rido and Taghi. It was that organisation, the Macra Mafia, but he was the kind of the Chilean connection, the source for the cocaine, whereas Rido and Taghi was the sort of the on-the-ground leader of that grouping, very violent.
I mean, El Rico really seems to be primarily involved in the importation of the cocaine. He had a series of front companies, both in the Netherlands and in Chile, and he primarily seems to have been involved in moving the cocaine. But he, like a lot of his communications, ultimately became part of his trial, and it showed how Taghi and him worked hand in hand the whole time. As you said, Taghi seems to have really controlled the streets, and ultimately they both ended up like in Dubai. There was talk, I think, during his trial, though we never actually saw the video of him and Daniel Kinahan together celebrating at some party. Taghi obviously was over there as well. And they seem to have really cornered the cocaine market into Europe, where although they bought from the Colombian cartels at source, and it was always said that some of that buying was done by the Kinahans, that they had those particular connections, that they all seem to play a different role, and that El Rico certainly played that logistical role in getting it from source back to Europe.
And let's rewind this a little bit, I suppose, I always sort of think it's around 2013, 2014 that these connections are made. And at this point, really, it is Spain and the Netherlands, which is more important than Dubai. These groupings will all together, including with their Italian and their Balkans drug partners, end up in Dubai. But before this, they're kind of forming this, essentially a business arrangement, which is pretty simple. You get together, you buy in bulk, you reduce your wholesale cost, and then you get to control the cocaine market. And that's essentially what they aspired to do. It's always been said that the construction, coming together of the European cartel was Daniel Kinahan's big idea. So he's in the Costa del Sol in 2014, as is El Rico and the grouping around Rido and Taghi. But there is something in the way at this point, and that's a rival Dutch mob under, again, some sort of Dutch Moroccans known as the Bucharins. I don't know whether we've ever pronounced that correctly. But there's two brothers, there's Karim and there's Samir.
Yeah.
And around 2014, I think Samir Bukharin, who's nicknamed Scarface, which will be easier for us for these purposes, is sitting in a restaurant in Benahavas, which is up in the mountains above the Costa. And he is at a dinner, at a meeting with a guy called Nouaf Fassi is at the table, another Dutch Moroccan, who's ultimately arrested here in Ireland in a Kinahan safe house some years later. But the story goes that Fassi puts his arm around Scarface, and with that, it's kind of seen as a as you know, the identification of somebody. And with that, a figure comes out of the darkness, runs at Scarface and shoots him dead. So in the background here, you have the coming together of the Dutch and the Irish mobs, really, with their partners from the Balkans and Italy. And you have really got the Dutch and the Irish are more important in all this, even though they will ultimately all be equal partners. But 2014 is a time where the Irish mob in Spain is beginning to come apart, because you have Daniel Kinahan and Gary Hutch kind of fighting together. And you have the Dutch Moroccans under El Rico and Ridwan Taghi going to war with rivals. And similar kind of gangland warfare plays out on the streets of the Netherlands over the next few years. Both Ireland and the Netherlands are really kind of woken up to the threat of organised crime, to the threat of these groupings, both of whom would have started out ultimately as street dealers in Dublin and in Amsterdam.
Yeah, there's a bit of a passing of the guard, I suppose, in the Dutch underworld, where you had these veteran criminals, probably from the 90s, guys like Mink Kok, who would have been very much associated with the Kinahans at that time. But these younger criminals, even though they would have worked with these people over time, they kind of take over. And of course, to an extent, Daniel Kinahan takes over from his own father at a similar time. These guys are all at that stage approaching the 40 mark. Obviously, the Kinahan succession is bloodless to that extent, but it's not like that in the Netherlands, and it sparks this incredibly violent street war, where there's beheadings. I mean, just a level of violence that is, even though Holland had been through waves of gangland violence for sure, it's kind of unprecedented. And at the end of it all, the last people standing really are Taghi and El Rico, who are, at that point, when that war sort of peters out, they are the undisputed kings. You talk about the super cartel coming together, and they all bring different things to the table. Certainly the Dutch criminals have these contacts in the ports like Rotterdam, which allow cocaine to come in on container ships and to be moved safely and quickly out of that port. So they're able to bring that. The Balkan gangs as well have these logistical networks, ships getting drugs into ports. And I suppose as well, technology ultimately allows this super cartel to come together, because the advent of encrypted phones, or certainly PGP Blackberries at one stage, allows them to really be able to operate these criminal cartels from a distance.
And as they are coming together, you can see that there's housekeeping being done.
Yeah.
There's people being taken out who may stand in the way. And I've always sort of believed that, I think the friendship between Daniel Kinahan and Gary Hutch had started to break away. There was, calls for money being owed and all the rest of it. But that's at the point of time that a friendship has broken down. I think Daniel Kinahan had ambitions far beyond his Dublin friends at that point. He was really bedding down with the Dutch Moroccans and with the Balkan criminals, and he was really seeing that he was going to make things even bigger and better than his father ever had. And that succession thing, he was going to basically bring the Kinahan name and the organised crime group to another level again. Which is why we were at this point, at this meal in Benahavas, and Samir Bukharin Scarface is taken out in 2014. And shortly after that, I started hearing that the Kinahans were involved in that.
Yeah.
Now, this is before kind of you realise that there had been this business arrangement which was coming together around then. And it had been said a few times by both underworld sources and some sources in policing that it was believed that one of the Kinahan hitmen, and we know subsequently because of various trials, that the Kinahan grouping at this point had a number of in-house hitmen who were on retainers, people like James Quinn, who was ultimately convicted of the murder of Gary Hutch. They were on retainers, but they were always also getting basically a Brucey bonus every time they killed somebody.
Yeah.
They were getting up to 100,000 for a kill, plus they were getting their retainers, their accommodation, etc., because the Kinahans were structured like an ordinary business, doing extraordinary things. But that became interesting, and it also didn't make much sense why the Kinahans would have been involving themselves in this sort of, rivalry between Dutch Moroccan criminals. And of course, interestingly, now that El Rico has served his sentence, is supposed to be on his way out, the Dutch don't want him out. They want to keep him in prison for whatever else. And in the background, they have been investigating other crimes they believe he's been involved in. And they're asking their Chilean counterparts, because they have to, because they extradited him ultimately from Chile in the first place, can they prosecute him on other crimes? And two of those crimes are murder, and one of them is a criminal known as Anas El Ajoudi, which we don't really know a huge amount about, but we'll give you a little bit of detail about it. But the second one was an attempted murder on Karim Bukharin, who was the brother of Scarface. And this was, your man's name is Taxi, is his nickname.
That's his nickname, yeah.
His nickname. And this was in 2018.
Yeah, so a Taxi ultimately was...
He survived and an associate died.
Yes, he survived and an associate died. He ultimately will be extradited himself back to Holland. He was regarded as being the successor to his brother, and I suppose the head of that criminal organisation. So they're looking to prosecute El Rico. While a lot of details aren't given, we can presume a lot of it is to do with digital communications, because certainly the communications between El Rico and Taji, who in particular seems to have done a lot of the arranging, all of those became more read out in court effectively during those trials. Phones associated with both of those two men. You heard them discussing liquidations, as they always call it in the Dutch reports. Assassination attempts, using various terms like ninjas was said to be for hitmen. Talking about movements of weapons. Like, of course, ultimately Taji effectively declared war on the Dutch state and was responsible for the murder of law officials, brothers of witnesses, an incredible level of violence. But El Rico's name was displayed during Taji's trial, even though he wasn't prosecuted for the crimes that he was being named as being linked to. So absolutely, the what was going on in Spain at that time was this coming together. Interestingly, in other details you hear of Gary Hutch being in a car owned by Mincock at one stage, driving away from Daniel Kinahan's apartment. So, I mean, these connect, and Mincock ultimately would have been a supplier to that other side of the Moroccan.
Yeah, he would have been an older kind of a criminal longer in the game, and a personal sort of friend really of Christy Kinahan Sr.
Yes.
From his time based between Belgium and the Netherlands, which was the time of his life that he really made those business connections and embedded himself down into sort of the top criminals in Europe, really.
Yes.
He left behind Dublin and Ireland and all he knew here. But interesting about that dinner, and you have Nawaf al-Fassi sitting there at that dinner. So these groupings were working together. I think ultimately the Bukharin brothers were probably a level above Ridwan Taghi, and therefore a level above El Rico, but there was ambitions as usual.
Yeah.
And there's that sort of sense of that double cross, isn't there?
There is.
Fassi is sitting breaking bread with Samir in 2014. They're quite comfortable on this hillside retreat in Benahavas, having and the arm goes around, and he's committed the double cross, and a bit of business is done that night.
And a bit of business, and you see that the fruits of that labour, if you want, in 2017, when all of these men are at Daniel Kinahan's wedding in Dubai. At that point, there's no doubt who's on top of Europe's drugs trade. I think the DEA who are there, who are actually monitoring Daniel Kinahan's wedding to see who's there, and they estimated that together those people had imported $23 billion worth of cocaine into Europe. So they're all there. El Rico's at that wedding. Taji is meant to be at that wedding. Rafael Imperiale is at Daniel Kinahan's wedding. And at this point, they have complete and utter control.
And you can see how, despite that wedding happening at that point, control, they have complete and utter control, but they still have to carry out assassinations too as part of their business because, of course, the Kinahan-Hutch feud continued on. It rattled on into 2018, really, until the end of it. Again, in Amsterdam, back on the Dutch turf, it was actually Anas El Ajoudi. His nickname is
It just has unpronounceable, I suppose. Bo something.
Bololo.
Bololo. Okay, we'll just
Sounds
go for
like
Bololo.
kind of cutesy.
Yeah.
Anyway, but it's him actually. It's the same individual I mentioned earlier. I thought that was Karim Boukarin's business partner. It's actually El Ajoudi, and he was assassinated in Amsterdam in 2018, and that is one of the murders that El Rico is now, that the Dutch are hoping they can prosecute him for.
Yes.
So that's happening in 2018 in the aftermath of that. But El Rico has already been arrested because it was in 2017 he was arrested and sent in Chile, and he was returned to the Netherlands after an extradition request and fight, and he was jailed in the Netherlands in 2019. So these guys are kind of like, you know, you think they're at their end when they've been arrested. You think, oh, here we go, this is the end of this. But in actual fact, they're still obviously operating, directing from behind bars and, you know, dictating who lives and who dies. And it's all down to business.
Well, of course, that was a huge scandal when it came to Taji, because he did end up in prison ultimately after being extradited from Dubai. But it was a huge issue in the fact that the Dutch authorities believed he continued to order murders from police custody. It became a huge scandal in the Netherlands because he was accused of doing this both over phones and through people that came in to meet him. You know, some of them, you know, it is believed they was passing notes. At one stage, he was recorded having a meeting with a trained solicitor who was also a relative. And so that all became a huge issue because he continued, certainly the Dutch police were openly saying that he was continuing to order assassinations. And those assassinations were not for rival drug dealers necessarily, but people that he believed were, you know, trying to bring him to justice. And ultimately, of course, he was linked to the murder of Peter de Vries while he was in prison. Peter de Vries was a well-known crime journalist. So, yeah, it became a huge issue how those people are managed within that prison system. El Rico has always sort of denied all involvement in everything. He has continued to appeal his sentence at times, but they certainly, it seems quite short. Of course, he did get an 11-year sentence, but he obviously, with remission or whatever.
You go back to 2017 when he's first arrested, so he's in custody ever since.
Yeah.
The other thing, I suppose, for the Dutch and as regards this, you know, upcoming release, if they don't get another prosecution for him, for El Rico, is, I mean, it was such a big political issue because there was the first time when there had been actually a beheading during this war between, you know, in a kind of a war for supremacy and power of the cocaine market, while ultimately Taghi and Rico were doing business with Daniel Kinahan. There was a beheading, and there was literally a head left in a bucket outside one of these Moroccan smoke shops in the centre of Amsterdam. And that was the first time we heard politicians describe narco-terrorism, that this was the new form of terrorism and this was a huge threat to Europe. You had the Dutch government speaking in relation to that. You had Europol starting to describe narco-terrorism had kind of reached European shores. And you had the royals in the Netherlands. You had a princess who was under threat and who couldn't go to college. You had the then Dutch Prime Minister Rutte, who had been under threat and had 24-hour security. You had the state of the Netherlands coming under threat while this kind of ground war was going on with these very heavily funded cocaine groupings. So it's going to be a big political issue for the Netherlands to see the likes of Rico walk free if the Dutch authorities can't secure a second prosecution.
Totally. I mean, it's very reminiscent of the Pablo Escobar, where he effectively declared war on the state of Colombia. And there was this feeling that was happening in the Netherlands. And, you know, it was quite bewildering considering our impression of the Netherlands as being a sort of liberal generally law-abiding country. And when you have solicitors being executed, witnesses, innocent relatives of witnesses being killed, there is you're on the edge of this breakdown of law and order. So yeah, it will be a big issue.
There was a slight breakdown really in policing there as well, because I do think that Ireland was on the brink of similar. I have no doubt about that. I think the Kinahan organisation were well capable of that. But I do think that the Gardaí here, and maybe it's because of the history of the country, and when you go all the way back, that the Gardaí had to sort of fight the existence and the activities of the IRA, and perhaps some sort of experience came with that. We also have our special criminal court in place, which is now ultimately just used for organised crime. And I can't remember the last dissident that was even going through there. But, the Netherlands wasn't prepared already.
No.
I don't think we totally were either, but I do think that, and there were innocent people killed and gunned down during the Kinahan Hutch feud because they were in the wrong place. They were on a street, or the gunman just, in many cases, just gotten tempered because they couldn't, get the right person. But I don't think there's any way that we should believe the Kinahans wouldn't have been capable of what happened in the Netherlands, of threatening state, institutions, journalism, police, judges.
Look, I mean, they subverted the world of boxing. I mean, let's be blunt about it. They used drug money to effectively take over a sport, and the impacts of that are still being felt to this day. So they would have certainly were capable of doing the same. I suppose what in the Netherlands had a very liberal tradition when it came to drugs and law and order. If you look back, and we sometimes do look back at the sentences people were being given in the 2000s for drug crimes, even involving millions of euros, it was 18 months, 6 months. Even Christy Kinahan himself, I think, had these really light sentences at times. So that was the tradition the country came for. But I don't think they weren't prepared for that level of violence. And of course, because of its position geographically, and the fact that Rotterdam is generally one of the biggest ports in Europe, they had this huge amount of money, and the EncroChat hack and those other hacks exposed how corrupted the people were in civil society. People working in ports, people working for the police, people working for all sorts of branches of the government. That cocaine millions allowed the drug gangs to corrupt people, and certainly things seem to have slowed since a number of those people have been put away. But yeah, it's a continuing battle. But they do seem to be at least more prepared to deal with it than they were.
I think we're going to have to reach back out to our colleagues in the Netherlands and start talking to them again about these stories as they, as they unravel, and see what is actually going to happen, and whether or not there's going to be cooperation with the Chileans on this. It's just been a while.
It's been a while. And
the other thing you said there, and I think that we must get back into it, our heads back into it, is the boxing and what's happening in it.
Yeah.
I still get messages in relation to suspicion that the Kinahans are still there, and I think a lot of them are well worth having a look at.
Yeah, and look, boxing is booming in the Middle East. There's no doubt about that.
Okay, Niall, thank you.
Thanks, Nicola.
I'm Nicola Tallant, and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.